2 weeks before my granddaughter's wedding, the man who had maintained our family inn for 19 years stopped me in the parking lot and said, very quietly, "Miss Audrey, don't go through the front door. Come around back with me first." He said it the way you say something when you're not sure you should be saying it at all. His name was Clifton, 64 years old, bad knee, never once in 19 years asked me for anything. He held the door for guests when he didn't have to. He fixed things before I knew they were broken. I had trusted him with spare keys to every building on the property since 2009. I followed him. He took me around the east side of the main lodge, past the tool shed, and stopped just below the open window of the small conference room we used for private meetings. My daughter-in-law's voice came through the screen first, then a man's voice I didn't recognize, then my son's. My son said, "She won't question the appraisal. She never questions numbers she doesn't pull herself." I stood on the gravel path with my hand on the wooden siding, and I listened. The man I didn't know said the closing timeline was tight, but workable. He said the final offer from Harborview Properties was $2.1 million. He said once I signed the transfer agreement, it would take approximately 3 business days to process through escrow. My daughter-in-law said, "And she has no idea what it's actually worth." My son said, "She knows what we've shown her." Clifton didn't touch my arm. He didn't say anything. He just stood beside me the way a person stands beside you when they know you need someone there and can't think of anything useful to say. Sycamore Creek Inn had been in our family for 31 years. My husband Reginald and I bought the property in 1993, a 6-room farmhouse on 4 acres outside of Asheville, North Carolina, with a leaking roof and a reputation for good pie from the previous owner's wife. We had saved $38,000 and borrowed the rest from Reginald's uncle, who made us sign a real piece of paper and charged us 3% interest because he said anything less wasn't serious. By the time Reginald died of a heart attack in 2017, we had 14 rooms, a full kitchen, a covered porch that seated 40, and a reputation that brought guests back year after year from as far as Philadelphia and Atlanta. He died in January in the office, sitting at his desk. The paramedics said it was likely very quick. I have thought about that every January since. After he was gone, I ran the inn alone for 2 years. Then my son came back from Charlotte, where he had been working in commercial real estate. He said he wanted to be closer. He said the city had worn him out. I believed both things because I wanted to. I gave him a role in the day-to-day management. It felt like handing something important to someone I loved, which is what it was supposed to be. He brought his business partner in the following spring. This man, I will call him by the name he introduced himself with, which was Thaddeus, had worked in hospitality acquisitions, or so he said. He had a way of speaking that made you feel slightly behind the conversation, like he was always 2 steps ahead and waiting patiently for you to catch up. My son admired that quality. I had a different word for it, but I kept it to myself because my son was happy, and I had not seen him happy in a long time. Thaddeus reorganized our booking system. He renegotiated our linen supplier contract and saved us $400 a month, which was real money. He brought in 2 new corporate clients for weekend retreats. Within a year, my son deferred to him on every financial decision. Within 2 years, I had stopped being asked. I noticed it the way you notice a draft in an old house. You feel it before you can find where it's coming from. I did not go back inside the inn that morning. I thanked Clifton and asked him not to say anything to anyone. He nodded once and went back to work. That was all he needed to do. He had done the hard part already. I drove to the Waffle House on Route 19 and sat in a corner booth and ordered coffee I didn't drink. I thought about what I had heard and tried to put it in order. The real estate appraisal I'd been shown 2 months earlier had valued the inn at $2.3 million. Thaddeus had brought it to me himself, in a folder, with a brief explanation about current market softness and how regional hospitality properties had lost ground since 2022. I had asked one question. He had answered it smoothly. I had signed the acknowledgement form because I trusted my son, and my son trusted Thaddeus. What I had just heard through the conference room window was that Harborview Properties was offering $2.1 million, which was described as the final offer. What I did not yet know, sitting in that booth, was what the actual number was. But I knew the number I'd been shown wasn't it. Before I do anything else, let me say something to anyone who's just finding this channel. Welcome. Take a moment and drop a comment, letting me know where you're watching from. I read every single one, and while this story is mine, I've changed a few names and some identifying details to protect the people involved, including the ones who don't deserve protecting. I called my attorney from the parking lot of the Waffle House. Her name is Bev, short for Beverly, though she has gone by Bev since law school and prefers it that way. She has been my attorney for 22 years, since we did the original property book in 2002. She is 71 years old, small, and speaks the way a very good surgeon operates. No extra movement, nothing wasted. I told her what I had heard through the window. I told her about the appraisal, the folder, the acknowledgement form I had signed. I told her about Harborview Properties and the $2.1 million closing timeline. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Don't sign anything. Don't change your behavior. Don't let your son know you were there. Can you get to my office this afternoon?" I said yes. She said, "Bring whatever financial records you can access. And Audrey, don't talk to anyone else about this until we know what we're dealing with." She brought in a man named Powell that same afternoon. He had been a forensic accountant for the IRS for 26 years before going private. He was 67, quiet, and had a way of going through numbers that reminded me of how Reginald used to go through a crossword, methodical, unhurried, certain that the answer was already in there somewhere and just needed to be found. I gave him everything I could pull remotely. 3 years of profit and loss statements, the booking records I still had access to from the original system before Thaddeus migrated us to the new one. The appraisal folder, he told me he'd have something by Wednesday morning. It was Monday afternoon. I drove home and made dinner and sat across from my reflection in the darkened kitchen window and thought about my son. He was 41 years old. He had been a serious child, the kind who carried his worries quietly and rarely asked for help with them. After his father died, he had come home for the funeral and stayed 3 weeks and cried exactly once, in the kitchen at 2 a.m. when he thought I was asleep. I had heard him through the ceiling. I had not gone downstairs because I knew he needed to do that alone. I had given him the management role because I thought it would anchor him. I think now that what I actually did was make him feel like a guest in his own inheritance. I made every significant decision myself and handed him the rest. I called it mentorship. He probably called it something else. That is the part I keep coming back to. Wednesday morning, Powell called at 7:40. He said, "I need you to come in. There are 3 things, and I want to show you each one in order." I sat across from him in Bev's office at 9 a.m. He opened a folder and laid 3 documents flat on the table between us. The first document was a comparative market analysis pulled from 2 independent hospitality brokers, not the one Thaddeus had used. The average valuation for a property matching Sycamore Creek Inn's specifications, acreage, room count, revenue history, location relative to Asheville's tourism corridor was $3.4 million. The low end was $2.9 million. The appraisal I had been shown valued the property at $2.3 million, and Harborview was offering $2.1 million. The gap between what I was being offered and what the property was actually worth was somewhere between $800,000 and $1.3 million. The second document was an email chain Powell had obtained through legal channels. Thaddeus to a contact at Harborview Properties, dated 6 weeks earlier. The email discussed, among other things, a principal accommodation arrangement, a private commission Thaddeus would receive upon successful close, structured as a consulting fee through a holding company he'd registered in Tennessee. The amount listed was $95,000. The third document was a filing from a civil case in Georgia, 2021. A woman in her late 60s, owner of a small resort property outside of Savannah, had sued her property manager and an outside consultant for colluding to undervalue and sell her business without her informed consent. The consultant in that case had used a different LLC name, but the structure was the same. The woman had settled for an undisclosed amount. The consultant's name in the filing matched the man I knew as Thaddeus. Bev looked at me across the table. She said, "We can file for an emergency injunction to halt any sale or transfer. We have enough to do that, but it will be cleaner and frankly more useful if we can let this move forward far enough to document the attempt on record." I asked about my son. Powell said my son's name appeared on 2 documents related to the property transfer. One was a preliminary authorization form. The other was an email in the chain where he confirmed the closing timeline with Thaddeus. Bev said he may not have known the full picture. The email is brief, but he knew something. I drove home alone. I walked around the property in the early afternoon, past the covered porch, past the garden Reginald had planted the year we added the 4 corner rooms. The hydrangeas were still blooming. He had planted them because I liked them. He never said that was why. I just knew. I thought about my son at 9 years old, helping his father haul the lumber for the first porch extension. He was too small to carry anything substantial, but he carried the lighter pieces and refused to be told he wasn't helping. I thought about the last 3 years, the way he had stopped bringing questions to me, the way he checked his phone when I was talking about renovation estimates, the way Thaddeus finished his sentences and he let it happen. He had not become someone new. He had slowly stopped trusting his own judgment and started borrowing someone else's. That is a quieter kind of losing yourself. It's harder to see from the inside. My granddaughter's wedding was 12 days away. The rehearsal dinner was booked in the inn's main event space. 200 guests were invited for the reception. It was supposed to be the largest event we'd hosted since Reginald's memorial service, and the first truly joyful one in 8 years. The signing was planned for the evening of the wedding itself, during the reception. Thaddeus had framed it to my son as a meaningful moment, the matriarch signing a legacy transition on the same night the family celebrated. He had told my son that I was aware it was coming and had agreed in principle. I had agreed to nothing. Bev walked me through the plan on Thursday evening. She said we would let Thaddeus present the papers at the reception. We would let him hand me the pen. We would have the injunction ready, and she would be seated at the event as a guest, which she was anyway because she had attended every major family occasion for 2 decades. She also told me she had spoken to a former colleague, now a magistrate judge in Buncombe County, who had agreed to be present at the reception in a private capacity. I said, "You've been busy." She said, "You pay me to be." I spent Thursday night calling people I trusted. Clifton already knew. He didn't need a call. I called the woman who had been our head housekeeper for 16 years. Her name is Alma. She is 62, runs the housekeeping staff the way a first sergeant runs a platoon, and has strong opinions about thread count and checkout times and people who leave towels on the floor. I told her I needed her to watch Thaddeus from a distance over the next several days. I told her not to engage him, just observe. She said, "I've been watching that man since the day he walked in here and called me sweetheart." She hung up without saying goodbye. That was how I knew she was serious. I also called my daughter-in-law. This was the hardest call. My daughter-in-law. This was the hardest call. Her name is Rosalind. She had been part of this family for 11 years. She had sat in the hospital waiting room with me when my son had his appendix out. She had learned to make Reginald's cornbread recipe because the grandchildren asked for it at Thanksgiving, and she wanted to be able to give them that. She had been in that conference room, and I had heard her voice, and I did not yet know which side of this she was standing on. She answered on the second ring. I said I needed to see her, privately, before the weekend. She said, "I was going to call you. We met at a coffee shop in Weaverville on Friday morning. She was there before me, sitting in the back with her hands around a mug she wasn't drinking from. She said, "I didn't know what he was doing at first. By the time I understood it, I thought saying something would blow up the whole family. I told myself it might not be as bad as it looked." She paused. "It was as bad as it looked. I know I waited too long. I'm sorry." I told her what I needed from her. I told her the plan. She nodded twice and did not cry, which I appreciated. She said, "Whatever you need." The wedding was on a Saturday in late October. Asheville in October is the kind of beautiful that makes people feel like they earned it. The leaves were at peak color. The property looked exactly the way Reginald and I had always imagined it would for something like this. The lights strung across the back porch, the tables set on the lower lawn, the whole place filled with people we loved. My granddaughter was radiant in the way that people only are when they are completely happy and don't yet know how quickly time will move. I held her hands before the ceremony and told her that her grandfather would have cried through the whole thing and pretended he wasn't. She laughed. I meant it. The ceremony was at 4. The reception followed immediately. By 6:30, the dinner service was underway. The band had started, and Thaddeus moved through the room the way he always did, comfortable and purposeful, shaking hands, saying the right things to the right people. At 7:15, he came to my table. He set a slim folder in front of me and sat down beside me and said in a low, pleasant voice that the paperwork was straightforward, that everything was in order, that this was just the formality we discussed. I looked at the folder, then I looked at him. I said, "Before I open that, I'd like to say something." He smiled and said, "Of course." I stood up from the table. The band was between songs. The room was not entirely quiet, but quiet enough. I said, "I want to thank everyone here for being with our family tonight. This property has been in our family for 31 years. My husband built it with me from nothing, and I have run it for the last 8 years without him. I have learned many things in that time. The most recent thing I learned was 3 weeks ago, on a Monday morning, when a man who has worked on this property for 19 years stopped me in the parking lot and asked me to take the back way in. The room had gone quiet. I nodded to Alma near the edge of the room. She had a laptop open on the serving station. The screen behind the small stage lit up. The first document was the comparative market analysis, 2 independent valuations, $2.9 million to $3.4 million. I said, "This is what this property is worth, according to 2 separate firms I hired independently. This is not what I was told it was worth." The second document was the email chain, Thaddeus and his contact at Harborview, the commission arrangement, the $95,000. A woman near the back of the room said something to the person beside her. I heard the sound of people shifting in their seats. Thaddeus said my name. His voice was still controlled, but his hand had come off the table. I said, "Please let me finish." The third document was the Georgia filing, the case from 2021. The same structure, a different LLC name, the same man. I said, "This is not the first time. There was a woman in Savannah who went through this 3 years ago. She is on a phone call tonight if anyone would like to hear from her directly." Alma clicked to the video call. Jewel. The screen split. A woman appeared, 70 years old, silver-haired, seated in what looked like a living room. She said her name. She said she had owned her resort for 22 years before a consultant helped facilitate its sale at a price nearly 40% below market. She said she had spent 2 years in litigation before reaching a settlement. She looked directly into the camera and said, "I am glad someone stopped this before it went any further. I am glad someone was listening." The magistrate, who had been seated at table 9 as my guest, stood. She identified herself and stated that an emergency injunction had been filed that afternoon, blocking any transfer of assets or ownership interest in Sycamore Creek Inn pending a full financial review. She said the injunction was now in effect. Thaddeus did not run. He didn't have anywhere to go. Two people I didn't know personally, but who had arrived with Powell that evening, positioned themselves near the exits in a way that suggested they had done this before. The room was very quiet. I looked at my son. He was sitting 2 tables away. He had not moved since I stood up. Rosalind had her hand on his arm. His face was the face of someone who has been watching 2 versions of the same story play out simultaneously and has just realized they were living inside the wrong one. I walked to his table when it was over. The crowd had broken into conversation again, the quiet, urgent kind that fills a room after something unexpected. My granddaughter had her new husband's hand in both of hers and was looking at me with an expression that was equal parts alarm and something that might have been respect. I sat down across from my son. He said, "Mom, I didn't—" He stopped. "I didn't know about Georgia." I said, "I know." He said, "He told me you were ready to let go." He said the numbers showed the business was softening and that you wouldn't admit it because you'd never been able to admit when something wasn't working. He said I was the only one who could see it clearly because I loved you, but I wasn't blinded by it. He stopped again. I said, "That is a very specific thing to say to someone." He said, "I know. I believed it because—" He looked down at the table. "Because I've spent 8 years feeling like I was managing something I was never actually trusted to lead. And when someone tells you that your instincts are right and your mother is the obstacle, part of you wants to believe it, because it's easier than believing you just haven't owned it yet." I sat with that for a moment. I thought about how many times in the last 8 years I had corrected his estimates without explaining my reasoning. How many times I had said, "Let me handle this," when what he needed was to handle it himself and be allowed to get it slightly wrong. I said, "Your father would have handed you the keys in year 3 and let you figure out year 4 on your own." I kept holding on to them because this place is the last thing I have of him, and I was afraid that if I let it change, I would lose even that. He didn't say anything. I said, "I made a crack in you that Thaddeus walked straight through. I understand that. We have a great deal to talk about, but not tonight." He looked up. I said, "Tonight you dance with your daughter at her wedding. Tomorrow we start over." Rosalind was crying quietly on his other side. I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine and told her that what she had said in that conference room, "The number is wrong, she needs to know," had mattered more than she knew. She had planted a doubt. Doubt was what kept me listening. She said she had been trying to find a way to come to me for weeks. She said she had told herself stories about why the timing was wrong, why it was better to wait, why maybe she was misunderstanding what she'd heard. I told her I understood that particular kind of silence better than she might expect. What came after took months, the way these things do. Thaddeus was charged with fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. The Georgia case was reopened in conjunction with ours. Arborview Properties cooperated with the investigation once it became clear the valuation data they'd been provided had been deliberately manipulated. Powell's audit confirmed that 2 of our strongest revenue years had been partially stripped from the presentation documents Thaddeus had shared externally. My son remained in his management role through the investigation. We brought in an independent financial consultant, a woman named Angie who had spent 15 years in hospitality accounting and had the particular gift of explaining things clearly without making you feel foolish for not already knowing them. She sat with my son every week for 4 months. By spring, he was running the budget review meetings himself. It was not the same as before. It was more direct, less careful. I had to practice not jumping in. He had to practice not waiting for permission. We were both learning something we should have learned years earlier, which is not unusual, just slower and more expensive than it needed to be. Clifton retired in February. We held a small gathering for him on the covered porch, just staff and a few long-time guests who asked to come. He shook my hand and said he was glad he'd caught me in the parking lot that morning. I told him that stopping me was the bravest thing that happened on this property in 31 years. He said, "I just didn't want to see you walk through the wrong door." I have thought about that many times since, about how many wrong doors we walk through because no one is standing outside them, or because someone is and we're moving too fast to hear them. I have run this inn for 31 years. I have made payroll in bad winters and rebuilt a collapsed porch roof and navigated a flood in 2018 that took out 3 guest rooms and our entire reservation system for 11 days. I know how to hold things together. What I did not know, what this year forced me to understand, is that holding things together too tightly can make the people standing beside you feel like they have nothing to hold. My son did not betray me because he was selfish. He made choices he shouldn't have made because someone gave him a story that explained his loneliness, and loneliness will find a story if you offer it one. That is not a character failure. That is how it works. I made that loneliness. I did not mean to, but I made it. And if I had taught him to lead instead of teaching him to follow me, there would have been nothing for Thaddeus to offer him. That is the thing that stays with me. Not the fraud, not the injunction, not the hours sitting in Bev's office going through documents. The Friday afternoon in March, when my son sat across from me in the office and told me that the inn felt like his father's legacy and my accomplishment, and he had never been sure where he fit inside it. I told him he fit at the center of it. He always had. I had just been standing in front of that center for so long that neither of us could see it clearly. In April, we made a small change to the sign at the property entrance. For 31 years it had read, Sycamore Creek Inn, Est, 1993, Audrey and Reginald Beaumont. We added one line below, smaller in the same script, family run. Always. My son drove the post himself. If you have stayed with me through all of this, thank you. I don't say that as a formality. This is the most personal story I have told on this channel, and there were several points in writing it where I stopped and asked myself whether it was too much to share. Then I thought about the woman in Savannah who said she wished someone had stopped her before she signed, and I thought about how different things might have been if she had found a story like this one before it was too late. Tell me in the comments if you had been standing in that parking lot with Clifton, knowing what he knew. Would you have said something? Would you have stayed quiet to protect your job, your place in someone else's story? I don't think there's a clean answer. I think it depends on what you believe you owe the people who have trusted you. Clifton believed he owed me the truth. He was right, and I am still, all these months later, trying to figure out how to deserve that kind of loyalty. I think the answer is to stop walking through doors without looking at who's standing outside them. I'm still learning, but I'm still here, and so is everything we built. I have thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened, not in any grand philosophical way, just in the quiet, practical way you think about things when you're in your 60s and you've had enough time to watch how your choices ripple outward in directions you didn't intend. Thaddeus didn't appear out of nowhere. He found a door that was already cracked open, and I was the one who left it that way. I spent 8 years holding this in so tightly that my son couldn't find a handhold in it. Every time he reached for something, I had already handled it. Every time he formed an opinion, I had already formed mine first and spoken it louder. I told myself I was protecting what Reginald and I built, and I was. But I was also, without meaning to, teaching my son that his instincts didn't matter as much as mine, that the inn was my achievement and his inheritance, and those are two very different things to live inside. Thaddeus understood that distinction better than I did. He walked into my son's loneliness and handed him a story that made it make sense. He said, "Your mother is struggling. The numbers show it. You're the only one who can see it clearly because you love her." That is a precise and terrible thing to say to someone who has spent years feeling invisible in their own family's work. My son believed it not because he was naive, but because it answered something that had been unanswered for a long time. That is how it works. People don't get manipulated through their weaknesses, they get manipulated through their unmet needs. The crack has to exist first. I made that crack, and understanding that is not about self-punishment. It's about being honest enough to learn something real from what happened. Clifton stopped me in the parking lot because 19 years of loyalty meant he couldn't do anything else. He didn't calculate the risk. He didn't think about whether it was his place. He just knew what he owed me and he paid it. That kind of integrity doesn't come from policy or obligation. It comes from a person deciding quietly and without fanfare what kind of person they want to be. Clifton had made that decision long before that Monday morning. The morning just gave him a reason to show it. Rosalind tried to do the right thing too, and she waited too long, and she knows it, but she did it eventually. The comment she made in that conference room, "The real number is different, she needs to know," was a small act that she didn't know I would ever hear. She said it anyway, even knowing what it might cost her. That matters. Doing the right thing when you're certain no one is watching is one of the harder versions of doing the right thing. My son is still learning. So am I. We have better conversations now than we did before any of this happened, which is a painful thing to admit. It took a fraud investigation and a public confrontation at a wedding reception for us to start talking honestly about the inn, about what it means to each of us, about what I was protecting and what he needed. We should have had those conversations years ago. We didn't, because I was busy managing everything and he was busy feeling managed. I think about what I want to pass on, not as a lesson, but as something lived. Not a list of rules, but a way of moving through hard things. You stay honest even when honesty is expensive. You pay attention to the people who have been loyal to you, because loyalty like Clifton's is rare, and it is trying to tell you something. You build other people's confidence alongside your own work, because the work will outlast you, and so will the people you either trusted or didn't. And when someone has wronged you, or when you have wronged someone, you look at the full shape of how it happened before you decide what it means. The full shape is almost always more complicated and more human than the simple version. I kept the inn, I kept my son. I am still learning to hold both without holding them so hard they can't breathe. Some days that is enough. Most days it is.